It's what you've been waiting for. It's bright early in the morning on Tuesday after the long weekend, and it's what you've been asking for. It's what you've wanted. It's what the people desire. Public accounts 2024. No, not foreign aid. No, we went through the public accounts, which is a whole separate entity, which is more wasteful spending going on in our country. And we went line by line by line, figuring it out, pulling it apart, figuring out how it all comes back together, and realizing, oh baby, this could be a little bit darker than we realized. Reg, how you feeling? What did you discover, sir?
Feeling good. Also feeling just tired after going through those documents. There's 3 volumes to it, multiple sections to each, hundreds upon hundreds of pages. And I think you start to see sideways after looking at that for quite a while. So hours and hours and hours looking at that. And one of the things that we wanted to do differently, because I think what we're seeing a lot right now is we're seeing folks on different accounts kind of like pulling out the most egregious spending. Like, it's like, $2 million to study like one-eyed newts in, Uganda or something like something foolish, right? And it is shocking. And you're like, I can't believe we spent money on something like that. But I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a different approach and actually look at something that I think is a little more hidden. It's not as egregious as that, because anybody can look at these ridiculous studies and go, why are we funding this? Who's buying this? Why are we putting tax dollars there? And I kind of wanted to call out a little bit of kind of the recklessness of the ministries. And one of the things that we hear Pierre say is he says, we are going to cut the waste that we see in Ottawa right now. And everybody's immediately jumping because the NDP loves saying this. They're like, he's going to cut dental care. Nobody's going to get their teeth cleaned. And it's like, you don't even have to touch that. There's so much waste and so much redundancy right now in between the ministries themselves. And we could be functioning at such a better rate, at such a cheaper rate, delivering more results and more value than we are right now. And that's kind of what we looked at.
I think the one thing people need to also keep in mind is when you talk, a politician gets up there and says, we're going to cut the waste. Something that people do not realize, and I've just kind of hit me just now, is that cut the waste is actually a very subjective term. It means something different to everybody else. It might be something different to Polyev versus what it means to us versus what it means to people in Alberta, this, that, the other. And that's kind of what we wanted to hit on with this was, let's actually talk about, let's identify the waste. Let's talk about what's happening, what is going on, how does it come together? And let's talk about these issues and how we can trim this down and making sure that we are limiting the opportunity for wasteful spending, but as well as corruption to happen within our government.
Exactly. And so kind of jumping into it a little bit there. So when we look at these ministries, one of the things I want to tell you right off the bat, I had help looking at this data because I was like, I did my business degree. I've got my master's from the business school, but this is on a whole nother level. And I was very fortunate. Friend of the show, he actually is doing his accounting degree. And he was looking at this, and he graduates in May with his accounting degree and is actually going on to his CPA. So I'm excited for him. He was looking at this. He goes, this follows no standard accounting rules. The government has their own way of writing all of this. He's like, it's painful to look at, because he did a first take of this, because I was like, how hard is this actually to look at? And he was like, it's immensely difficult. So to save you all the trouble of this is what we found out. So when looking at the total expenses, one of the things you'll hear from a lot of creators right now, because they're pulling this number out, this one's actually easy to find. $534 billion is what we're spending. Almost $535 billion, in the past 2023 to 2024. That wasn't even counting all the new stuff we added.
True.
So looking at this, we look at the finance department, or the Ministry of Finance. $135 billion going to that ministry. Employment and Workforce Development, $124 billion. The national revenue, almost $60 billion. It's obscene numbers. And I'm going, why are those numbers so high? Like, what is it that you're possibly doing in the Department of Finance?
Almost a quarter of the actual number.
Exactly. That is costing so much money. And then when you go down and look at like health, I'm like, health, $14 billion. We know that the health transfer is almost 50. Why the heck is it only 14 billion? And so this is the problem that we're seeing. This is the game that's being played with these documents. because it's easier to kind of obscure things and hide things and make money disappear when you kind of lay it out in this format. And so what's happening is that in the Department of Finance, so that transfer to the provinces, so that, $50 billion, that's counted for in finance. So other things that are delivered through like workforce development and stuff like that, that comes through finance. And so you have what's happening is that you have all these transfers that might be for housing or for health or for any other social program that should be under those ministries, coming out of finance or coming out of workforce development, or just coming out of odd ministries where they're adjacent but should be held within that ministry. If we're doing things for housing, it should be coming out of the housing minister. But we're not seeing that. So what happens then is you actually create duplication of efforts and duplication of spending. And that's what's really annoying about this document.
And then you can also hop into the House of Commons and be obscure in terms of your stats and your facts because it's being covered in different areas and different terms of spending. So you can get up there and say, well, we've done this for housing and we've done that and we spent that much on houses and X, Y, and Z. And it's like, how can someone actually track down and make sure that that checks out? It's really hard to do with this type of setup.
Oh, exactly. If you go to the next one here. So what I specifically was looking at, knowing that, was like, what is the overlap between the ministries? And so for an example, to kind of like really tie it all together for everyone to make it a little bit easier to understand. So all of these like ministries have funding streams that tie housing and economic development together. So finance, employment and workforce development, infrastructure and communities, innovation, science and industry, and then Indigenous services. And so I kind of get where Indigenous services is a little bit separate because they have different governing systems on reserve where, their housing might come out of a different pot. But I really believe that like that should be more directly tied to the Minister for Housing, because then that minister could then say, we've built this many, houses in Canada and this many on reserve. And you know what I mean? Like make it a little more clear. By hiding it under Indigenous services, where you have everything from like childcare and child welfare and clean drinking water and everything else under that, it kind of gets obscured. And so I kind of asked the question, I said, wouldn't it be more efficient if the Ministry of Housing and Infrastructure handled everything housing related?
Shoot.
A wild,
That's a thought.
Wild thought.
That's a thought.
Wow. But instead we hide pieces of it in these different categories. And then when you break them apart, they each have a research and like consulting element to them too, where they'll write a study or produce a paper under each of these different departments. And some departments will actually be doing the same thing, not talking to each other because they're separate ministries, and then just be wasting our money in that way.
And this actually tends to lead more to indirect bloat as well. Because what happens is, again, when you have an official opposition trying to check out what you're saying in the House of Commons, they then have to hire more staffers to go through all these documents to see and track down if what you're saying is true, which means it's more bloat, more is going on the taxpayer dollar to sort this all out. And that's what the issue of obscurity causes, more bloat in the government too.
Exactly. It's a crisis of transparency is what it is. And these documents highlight that. If you go to the next one. So I was just looking at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, because we all know that they've done a great job. They've
bang up over there.
Yeah. So they provide $2.88 billion in assistance for housing needs, financing for housing, $1.35 billion, housing expertise and capacity development.
Gee.
That's the fancy way of saying consultant.
Yeah.
$1.19 billion. And then when you look at the total Ministry of Infrastructure and Communities expenditure, almost $20 billion. Do we have $20 billion worth of housing built in Canada right now? I don't think so. I'm not seeing it being built. When we see our housing starts, the worst that they've been in decades. Where is this money actually going?
Yeah, where's the results? As we want to see
exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the overlap, CMHC and Infrastructure Canada both provide direct funding for housing. So it's it's redundancy. So
classic.
Yeah, I love it. Two entities doing the work, billing the taxpayer and less work getting done. Love it.
Yeah, you're doing what the liberals do best. Pay for things twice and still not get it.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
See pipelines for further.
Yeah, it's exactly.
So this is another one that's a big one. And this one is like very close to heart because we know that there's a lot of folks in this country who are losing their jobs, especially when you look at the unemployment rate for youth in this country. And then you look at the amount of money that they're spending on job creation initiatives, like millions of dollars, like that list alone there, like totaling over $1 billion being spent on job creation initiatives.
And unemployment is at an all-time, well, not an all-time high, but it's almost as high as it's ever been.
Yes, exactly. And for the youth, it's actually the worst it's ever been for youth in this country. So that is at an all-time high. And so what's happening, and the only reason why employment isn't worse is because it's being artificially propped up by the public service. And so when you see examples like in New Brunswick, when they paid Sears, the former company, to set up a call center, and they paid them millions of dollars to set up this call center, taxpayer dollars. They had the call center for maybe a couple months, and then it went out of business, and all those people lost their jobs, and all that money just went to Sears executives. It's like, I'm looking at this and going, we're literally paying companies for us to work for free. You would be better off if the money never went to the companies at all and it stayed in your pockets and you got to decide how to spend that money. But that's not how this is working. We have so many agencies funding workforce training, and you could just streamline that into only one ministry taking that on. It's very frustrating. And so just kind of like one of the big things that we've been hearing lately too, that you'll love, is that the people who could actually take these documents and make sense of them, your Deloitte, your KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, EY, Ernst & Young, like these are the folks who have the expertise to break these documents down and go, hey, government, you're doing a bad job. Basically act like Canada's Doge.
Yeah.
They are getting paid stupid amounts of money. So this is only from volume 3. Deloitte, $6 million. KPMG, $7.4 million. PricewaterhouseCoopers, almost $40 million. EY, $4 million. That's 4 consulting companies out of the 100 that are like listed in this document, okay? And they're all like unnamed company this getting, this amount of money here. And also too, if it's below a certain threshold, they don't even have to list that amount. And they just basically put it in an other stamp and then the total amount. So you would never know where that money is going. And that's the big problem that like Elon's having right now with the Treasury Board in the States, where he's going, there's no indicator. We have no idea where this money went to because it was below a threshold or they just didn't put it. We're seeing the exact same thing happen in our financial documents where they're not required to disclose where that money is going.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Elon's facing in the States as well, and why he's getting railed by the media. It's not only because they're upsetting the apple cart in general, but it's because he's going in and it's like, okay, we're going to axe this. And then he's at the mercy of the system saying, okay, he axes this and he has to wait and see, all right, what does that impact? Then he gets the answer of where that money went. And that he literally has to go in and break the system to figure out what all this money went to. And essentially the same thing's going to happen here.
It has to, because when we look at this and we say $17.7 billion across various departments for professional services, that's absurd. Why do we even have a public service then?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we just get rid of the entire public service and have consultants do it if we're paying them that much? Mm-hmm. It's absurd. Department of National Defense, my old stomping grounds. For those of you who didn't know, I was a medic for 3 years in the military. $4.5 billion on their professional services. Why?
Yep. What are we seeing for it?
Exactly.
The amount of military I've talked to who've reached out to the show is astounding, and seeing how ill they're taken care of, and how our military and our active military is being poorly taken care of. Where is that money going? I would genuinely like to know.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to our vets, and it's not going to our active service members.
Yeah, it's going to consultants because we can see it here.
Yep.
Go to the next one. And so what I was saying there, I was like, even if you reduced it by a small percentage, you'd still get $5 billion worth of savings.
Yep.
And that's still like 10 or 12 billion dollars going out the door. So there needs to be some dramatic changes there. This one is going to get a lot of pushback. Foreign aid and international development, $5.8 billion goes to global affairs and their spending. I know that global affairs as a department is more like 8.2 as a total, but global affairs spending, though, their actual spending is around $5.8 billion. And I was looking at the fact that I was like, okay, if you reduced it by 5 to 10%, you could free up to almost $1 billion from that. I would like to see us follow the US model and maybe not shut it off entirely, because we still have, consulates and things around the world that need to be run. But if you can't run it on like $1 to $2 billion, what the hell? Like, what are you eating at those consulates? Like, you know what I mean? That is costing that much money. You know what I mean? I understand that maybe there's some security that needs to be paid for, but I cannot see us needing to spend more than $1 to $2 billion on this.
Well, I'll tell you, as someone who's talked to someone who's been in this industry and who's worked in this capacity, especially at the consulate, working as a representative of Canada, they go to a lot of parties. Lots of parties happen abroad in various countries around the globe for our representatives to go and talk to the other representatives of other countries. And so that's where a lot of that money will go to, is to fund food for events and to make sure that we are keeping diplomatic ties with various countries. And that's typically that's part of the money that will go to, is to facilitate that as well.
You know how we communicate our value and diplomatic ties to other countries? Producing things that they actually want to buy.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea, isn't it?
And like, I look at things like the funding allocations for the International Development Research Center, $164 million. Why aren't we funding that through our traditional research centers that we already have established, that we already broke down? Canadian Commercial Corporation, $13.9 million in expenditures. Why?
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of like where we're at right now when it comes to this type of conversation. Is it's clear. We've gone through it. There's a lot of money that's floating, which we've seen with the global affairs issue. But as well is there is multiple departments who are duplicating services, who are not being clear, who are creating obscurity that is not allowing for, as you said, transparency in our system, causing for more money just to kind of disappear into, I don't know, places like the family company of Carneys. Sorry, the Carney family of companies. Did I do that by accident? You don't know. You'll never know. But this is how that works. I just say I use his name because we know the name, but there's many people who are like him in the system that have just these companies who just feast off of the tax dollar because of this stuff.
GC Strategies.
Yep. There's another one.
Mr. Boissonneau's other Randy, who runs his company. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we're just seeing it everywhere. And I think what I want to kind of hit home with this, the most frustrating part of all this is the fact that it's so, like you said, so hard to understand, and it doesn't need to be. They need to follow standard accounting practices so that anybody with an accounting mind and degree can read this. They need to create real executive summaries for the average Canadian to be able to actually read through it. It should not take a degree to see at a high level what each ministry is spending. I don't know if I said this to you before the show or on the show, but basically ministry, total spend.
Yeah.
And then if you want to deep dive into that later, then there's a whole section on each one of those ministries. They don't do that.
No.
And so that's what's missing in all of this, is just some clear direction on where things are going. And right now it's just looking like, and you know what, you can say that at worst it's malicious and purposeful and deceitful. And at best it's just ignorant and siloed and stupid, honestly.
Yep.
You know what I mean? It's just wasteful. And so, and that's at best. That's giving a lot of grace. Yeah. So I look at this and I'm very frustrated.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is like, we won't get this with the current government and the way it is set up. And that's why it's really important to try and get a fresh government with a fresh mandate in there so that we can put pressure on them and be like, hey, you talked about this on the campaign trail. Start paying up. Let's have a conversation about it.
Yeah. And be careful of anybody who talks about the cuts that Pierre wants to do. Because when we look at this information that I've just presented you, there's lots and lots of areas that you could cut waste that some people would be upset about. But honestly, I look at this and the big thing that I'm hearing right now from the NDP in particular is like, Pierre is going to take away your dental care. They don't have to take away dental care. Dental care right now, they said it's going to cost $13 billion over the next 5 years to establish. A lot of that's probably going to Sun Life. Like, let's be real. And then $4.4 billion to maintain after each year. If you total that all up, you're still under the amount that you're spending on just the consulting fees for consulting services with this government. You could completely cut out all of the consulting and fund the entirety of dental care.
Yeah.
And you would never lose it.
Yeah.
Personally, I think that's a crappy idea, not because I don't think that we need to get rid of the consultants, but mostly because I think that dental care should be held by the provinces, kind of like the rest of healthcare. Because why is your teeth separate? I don't know. And I think that we already have established programs. And if we just spent this whole time talking about creating extra unnecessary services, this would be one of them.
Yep.
Put the money in the province's hands. Let them deliver dental care through their established dental care programs that they have right now, just the same way as we give them a health transfer for healthcare in their provinces. Cut Sun Life out of this altogether, cut the consultants out of this altogether, cut the bureaucracy, and just move the money to where it needs to go. And I think that's essentially what the whole thing comes down to, is put the money in the areas where it needs to go, make it explicit and clear, reduce the redundancies, reduce the administration, and you'll see savings.
And just like that, you will 100% see it. And we will keep talking about it. We'll keep putting pressure on it so that we can see some results, hopefully with a new government, with a fresh mandate, and we can see results where our tax dollars aren't being consistently wasted. That's it for us. Have yourselves a good one. We're out.